They thought the night was their ally. For years, Japanese pilots believed darkness would shield their movements, hide their bombers, and allow them to strike American ships with devastating surprise. But what they did not know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that the Americans had developed a terrifying new weapon: night fighters. Equipped with secret radar systems and flown by daring pilots who hunted in the dark, these aircraft turned Japan's greatest advantage into a nightmare. For the Japanese aviators, the shock was immediate, terrifying, and often fatal. To understand how this story begins, we have to step back into the brutal air war over the Pacific in 1942 and 1943. At that time, Japan's military aviation still carried an aura of invincibility. The famous Mitsubishi Zero fighter was unmatched in agility and range. Japanese pilots, many of whom had been veterans of the war in China since the late 1930s, were highly trained and experienced in tactics. During daylight, the Japanese dominated, but at night, it was a different game. Nighttime offered Japan a way to avoid America's growing air power. Under the cover of darkness, Japanese bombers could launch raids on American bases, supply depots, and even naval ships without the same level of interception they faced in daylight. For a while, this tactic worked. The Americans had radar on ships and on land, but the ability to chase enemy planes through pitch-black skies seemed nearly impossible. Picture the scene: a Japanese bomber crew flying high above the Pacific at night, feeling the confidence of invisibility. Below them, they imagined American sailors straining their eyes into the darkness, helpless against the unseen approach of death. For these crews, the night was sanctuary, a cloak protecting them from America's increasingly powerful arsenal. But behind the scenes, the United States was quietly preparing a countermeasure, one that would change aerial warfare forever. American engineers, working with British technology, had perfected compact airborne radar systems. No longer confined to massive ground installations, radar could now fit inside the nose of a fighter plane. This was revolutionary. For the first time in history, a single pilot could locate, stalk, and destroy an enemy aircraft in complete darkness. The introduction of the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, America's first dedicated night fighter, marked the beginning of this terrifying new era. With its radar operator seated behind the pilot, the P-61 could detect Japanese aircraft miles away, track their movements, and guide the pilot directly into striking range, all without the enemy ever knowing they were being hunted. At first, Japanese pilots couldn't comprehend what was happening. Reports began trickling in, bombers failing to return from night raids, crews swearing they had been attacked by invisible ghosts. Some Japanese survivors told stunned comrades that they never even saw their attackers. One moment, they were flying safely through darkness, and the next, they were engulfed in fire. This was the beginning of the end for Japan's nighttime advantage. But how exactly did America spring this trap? And why were Japanese pilots so unprepared for this shocking development? That's what we're about to uncover as we dive into the gripping tale of how America's night fighters shattered Japan's confidence in the dark skies of the Pacific. The Pacific Air War in 1942 and 1943 was defined by innovation, desperation, and trial by fire. For the Americans, every month seemed to bring a new crisis. From Pearl Harbor to the brutal early battles in the Philippines, the U.S. military was constantly forced into a defensive posture. Japanese bombers and fighters seemed unstoppable. And American commanders understood they needed a solution, not just for daylight encounters, but for the terrifying raids that struck at night. It was during these critical months that the seeds of night fighting were planted. Across the Atlantic, the British Royal Air Force had already begun experimenting with radar-equipped fighters to combat German bombers in the Blitz. Their early systems were bulky and difficult to use, but the technology worked. American scientists and military planners quickly realized this was the key to leveling the playing field in the Pacific. But technology alone wasn't enough. Pilots needed to be trained to fly and fight in conditions that had previously been considered nearly impossible. Imagine sitting in the cockpit of a twin-engine fighter. The sky around you pitch black, with no visible horizon and no stars through the clouds. The only guide? The soft green glow of a radar screen, operated by the man sitting behind you. Trust between pilot and radar operator became the most critical bond of all. Without it, they were both lost. In the early stages, the Americans relied on stopgap measures. Modified versions of existing aircraft like the Douglas A-20 Havoc and the Bristol Beaufighter, loaned by the British, were fitted with radar equipment and rushed into service. These makeshift night fighters weren't perfect. They lacked the speed and firepower needed to fully dominate the skies, but they offered something the Japanese weren't prepared for: the ability to strike back at night. Meanwhile, Japanese strategy depended heavily on nighttime operations. In places like Guadalcanal, Rabaul, and New Guinea, Japanese bombers launched raids under the cover of darkness to harass American airfields, disrupt supplies, and keep troops in a constant state of fear. For the Americans stationed on those islands, the drone of Japanese bombers at night became a chilling sound, a reminder that nowhere was safe after sundown. But slowly, the balance began to shift. As radar technology improved, the U.S. Air Force and Navy began to record their first nighttime victories. The early successes were modest. One bomber intercepted here, another downed there, but the psychological impact was enormous. Japanese pilots who had once viewed the night sky as their sanctuary started whispering rumors of strange, unseen enemies. And then came the arrival of a game-changer: the Northrop P-61 Black Widow. Purpose-built for night combat, it dwarfed most fighters of its day, bristling with powerful cannons and equipped with radar that could track multiple aircraft at once. It was unlike anything Japan had ever encountered. Still, the Japanese High Command initially dismissed the reports. To them, the losses were attributed to bad luck, mechanical failure, or pilot error. The idea that Americans had developed a machine capable of hunting them in total darkness seemed impossible. This underestimation would prove to be one of their greatest mistakes. The stage was set. American night fighters were growing more skilled with each mission, while Japanese bomber crews began flying with a sense of unease, wondering if the darkness they trusted might suddenly turn against them. The hunters and the hunted were about to switch places, and the shock was only just beginning. By late 1943, the Americans were ready to unleash their night fighters in earnest. The P-61 Black Widow had begun to arrive in the Pacific, and with it came a new era of aerial combat. For Japanese pilots, what had once been an open sky of safety transformed into a killing ground. The first shocking encounters came during raids on American bases in the Solomon Islands. Japanese Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, often called flying cigars because of their vulnerability, would set out at night believing that their speed and altitude gave them protection. Instead, they found themselves stalked by unseen predators. From the bomber crew's perspective, disaster struck without warning. Suddenly, tracers ripped through the dark, engines exploded, wings tore apart, and men leapt into burning skies. Survivors who returned spoke of phantom hunters that seemed to appear out of nowhere. What they didn't realize was that the Black Widow S radar could detect them miles away. The radar operator quietly guided the pilot into position, sometimes trailing a bomber for 10 or 15 minutes before striking. When the order came, visual contact, range 1,000 feet. The pilot opened fire with devastating 20mm cannons. To the Japanese, it felt like they were ambushed by ghosts. One Japanese pilot later recalled with disbelief, "We flew believing the night was our shield. Then suddenly the Americans were there firing. We never saw them coming. How could this be?" The impact of these encounters went far beyond individual losses. Morale among Japanese bomber crews plummeted. Missions that had once felt routine became terrifying gambles. Each night flight carried the same haunting question: would they return alive, or vanish into the dark like so many before them? The Americans, meanwhile, gained confidence with each victory. Pilots began to master the difficult art of night fighting, trusting their instruments, staying calm in the black void, and relying on split-second teamwork with their radar operators. Some squadrons developed reputations as phantom hunters, feared and hated by the Japanese. By early 1944, entire Japanese formations were being shredded at night. One infamous engagement over Rabaul saw several bombers intercepted in a single raid, their wreckage lighting up the night sky like burning comets. U.S. intelligence officers listening to intercepted Japanese communications noted the rising panic. Words like invisible and inescapable were repeated again and again. This was the heart of the conflict. Japan's once safe night skies were collapsing, and the realization hit them hard. The Americans were not only catching up technologically, they were surpassing them. Every downed bomber, every terrified crew that limped home, chipped away at the myth of Japanese aerial superiority. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because as America perfected its night fighters, it began using them not only to defend bases, but to escort bombers and hunt Japanese fighters. For the first time, Japan faced the terrifying prospect that no time of day, neither sunlit skies nor moonlit nights, was safe anymore. By mid-1944, the tide of the Pacific War had shifted dramatically. The Americans were no longer on the defensive. They were advancing island by island, bringing the fight closer to Japan itself. For the Japanese Air Force, nighttime operations had once been their secret weapon. Now, those very missions became a death sentence. The P-61 Black Widow had proven itself lethal, but it wasn't the only tool in America's arsenal. The U.S. Navy had begun deploying carrier-based night fighters, modified Grumman F-6F Hellcats and later F-4U Corsairs, equipped with smaller radar units. This development was a turning point. No longer confined to land bases, night fighters could now launch directly from aircraft carriers and sweep vast stretches of the Pacific in total darkness. Japanese pilots, who once planned surprise raids against U.S. fleets under the cover of night, suddenly found themselves intercepted far out at sea. The shock was profound. As one captured Japanese airman admitted under interrogation, "We believed your ships slept at night. Instead, your fighters were waiting for us, even in the black skies above the ocean." One of the most decisive turning points came during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, sometimes called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. While most of the battle was fought in daylight, American night fighters played a crucial role in intercepting Japanese aircraft attempting to escape or regroup under darkness. The Japanese had entered the battle with hundreds of planes. By the time it was over, their air arm was shattered, losing more than 600 aircraft in total. The message was clear. Whether in day or night, the skies belonged to America. Back at Japanese bases, the psychological toll was devastating. Crews began altering flight paths, cutting engines to glide in silently, or flying at dangerously low altitudes to evade radar, all desperate attempts to survive. None of it worked for long. Radar-guided fighters continued to pick them off, and losses mounted. For the Americans, night fighting became not just a defensive tactic, but an offensive weapon. Black Widows and Hellcats began intruder missions, penetrating Japanese airspace at night to hunt enemy planes on their own runways. These missions spread panic across Japanese bases. Pilots waiting to take off suddenly found themselves under attack before they even left the ground. Mechanics and ground crews dove for cover as tracers stitched across tarmacs and hangars erupted in flames. The turning point was clear. The Japanese no longer trusted the night. The very cloak that had once given them advantage was now ripped away, leaving them exposed to an enemy they could neither see nor stop. But the most chilling realization was yet to come. As American forces pushed toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa, night fighters would encounter Japan's most desperate tactic of all, the kamikaze. And in those dark skies, the stakes of night combat reached their most terrifying climax. The war in the Pacific was entering its most critical stages. By late 1944, the Japanese Empire was cornered, its vast territorial holdings shrinking day by day under relentless American offensives. The skies, once dominated by Japan's feared Zeros, were now contested by advanced American fighters. Yet it was the mysterious shadow hunters of the night that delivered one of the most shocking blows to Japanese morale. The climax came during the Philippines campaign, particularly over Leyte Gulf. Japanese airmen still believed they could ambush vulnerable American bombers under the cover of night. But what they encountered was a nightmare they never anticipated, an invisible predator that struck with surgical precision. Reports from Japanese pilots during this period were filled with confusion and dread. One account, preserved in post-war interrogations, described a bomber crew on a mission toward Leyte. They thought they were alone in the moonlit sky when suddenly, tracers ripped past their cockpit. A burst of cannon fire tore through the fuselage, killing the co-pilot instantly. They never saw the attacker. By the time the survivors realized what had happened, the mysterious aircraft had vanished back into the darkness. That attacker was a P-61 Black Widow, its radar-guided nose locked on target long before the Japanese ever knew they were being stalked. What stunned the Japanese wasn't just the firepower, but the psychological effect. There was no warning, no dogfight, no chance to evade. Death came from the unseen. As American night fighters grew bolder, they began hunting over Japanese bases themselves. On Okinawa, Black Widows prowled above airfields, waiting for enemy aircraft to take off. Pilots reported watching Japanese bombers ignite their engines, roll down the runway, and then, just seconds after lifting into the air, be torn apart by radar-directed gunfire. To the Japanese, it felt like being attacked by ghosts. The climax of this unseen battle unfolded in 1945. By then, the Japanese had resorted to desperate measures, kamikaze strikes. These suicide missions were terrifying to Allied sailors, but even the kamikazes weren't safe from America's night hunters. Radar-guided fighters intercepted them long before they could reach their targets, shredding them mid-flight. For the first time, the Japanese discovered that even the night, once their shield of secrecy, was now claimed by the Americans. A Japanese officer later reflected in disbelief. "We believed night protected us, but the Americans could see in the dark. Their planes appeared like phantoms, and then vanished again into the black sky." This realization was more than a tactical defeat. It was the collapse of a psychological advantage Japan had relied upon since the early days of the war. By mid-1945, with their cities under firebombing raids and their fleets destroyed, Japanese pilots flew into battle with an almost hopeless resignation. The once proud hunters of the night had become prey. The radar, the Black Widow, and the relentless American night fighters had changed the balance of the Pacific Air War forever. This was the shocking truth that stunned Japanese aviators. America had stolen the night. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific skies told a very different story than the one painted in 1941. Japan's once feared pilots had been humbled, their dominance shattered not only by superior numbers, but by technology that rewrote the rules of aerial combat. Among the most haunting revelations for Japanese aviators was the discovery that America's night fighters, the unseen predators of the skies, had turned darkness itself into a weapon. In post-war debriefings, Japanese officers admitted they had no real counter to radar-equipped aircraft. While they experimented with crude night-fighting tactics, even equipping some planes with primitive detection devices, none came close to the sophistication of the P-61 Black Widow or the radar-trained American crews who flew them. For every adjustment the Japanese tried, the Americans were already 2 steps ahead. Here lies the surprising twist. Despite the Black Widow's terrifying reputation, its kill numbers were relatively modest compared to daylight fighters. But its psychological effect was enormous. Pilots and crews dreaded missions at night, haunted by the thought that somewhere in the blackness, an invisible hunter might already be watching them. The fear of the unseen enemy broke morale faster than bullets alone ever could. Even more fascinating is the legacy of these night fighters. The techniques pioneered by P-61 crews, radar interception, teamwork between pilot and radar operator, and hunting in total darkness, laid the foundation for modern air combat. Today, every stealth fighter and advanced interceptor traces part of its lineage back to those eerie, nocturnal duels over the Pacific, For Japan, the war's end was a sobering lesson. Courage and tradition could not withstand an enemy who had mastered both technology and strategy. Their shock at America as night fighters was not just about losing battles. In the dark, it was about realizing that the future of warfare belonged to those who could see beyond the limits of human senses. So, the next time you hear the roar of a jet slicing through the night sky, remember the P-61 Black Widow, the phantom that stole the darkness from Japan's pilots and turned night into America's battlefield. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most dramatic and lesser-known stories, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another history documentary. And let me know in the comments, what other hidden stories from World War II would you like us to uncover next?